Let's have a talk, let's have a chat, talking about a little this and that. Hello and welcome to This and That. We are hosting Daughter of Zion Eternally, and she is doing a study on the Jewish roots of Christendom. To listen to more of her work on This and That, you can go to talkingaboutthисandthat.wordpress.com and click on podcasts. You will have to scroll down to find the recordings for Daughter of Zion Eternally. In our last episode, we talked about the Torah and kingdom law and briefly mentioned both the Decalogue and commandments that occur in the Gospels. We will begin to go into depth in this episode on the Decalogue. Torah has in it principles that act as guidelines to a godly life. Torah will not get one into heaven, now or ever, because it is so impossible to keep outside of Christ. But it was most definitely a set of guidelines and principles that teach God's way. Point. In Paul's epistle to the Romans, he makes mention that the law is weak due to the flesh. It wasn't designed to save you. It wasn't designed to do anything more than tell you what was sin and what was not. Meaning, it didn't save you, it condemned you, actually. You need a Savior. That Savior is Jesus, God's Christ, and the sacrifice that He's made in His body and His blood. In this episode, we will start to look at the 10 Commandments, also called the Decalogue. Everything else springs forth from these. So, without further ado, Commandment number 1. You shall have no other gods before me. God is a standalone type being. He created everything from nothing by His own word through Jesus. God sculpted, if you will, man, and after His own image. I don't read where the angelic race was ever sculpted after His own likeness. So unto us He has paid a high note of praise. God has no needs except the desire to fellowship with what He creates. But desire is not need. Anything that man may conceive in his mind to carve, to sculpt, to screw together, and place all his hopes in is futile. For the object made is constructed from basic elements that are the building blocks of the universe, even though those elements may have been manipulated by mankind into new and other complex items. Furthermore, it is constructed by one who is in himself a product of construction by another in the first place. Man, created of God, building the Twin Towers, the Freedom Towers, the Empire State Building, your house, your kitchen appliances. Need I say more? Oh, and if you think, well, all these synthetic things, no, that's just chemistry. Chemistry is taking stuff that already occurs and making new compounds, and then taking those compounds and making other compounds. You're still starting with basic building blocks. You didn't make it from your own mind. The original elements, the original chemistry, the base elements, it's got to come out of the periodic table, folks, or it isn't being concocted. So, no, chemistry doesn't trump God. Chemistry simply manipulates what God first stuck in place. We're good. We're not that good. Sorry. So, if one takes a moment to reflect and consider the magnificence of one's own humanity, wouldn't it follow that if the maker of such perfection existed, it would be unto that individual, even the whole of humanity, to venerate and give a vote of thanks to their Creator? This isn't the sermon that will fly well in most circles today, because it certainly does not stroke our egos, but truth is truth no matter how unflattering. In other words, you were made, a debt of worship is owed. Believe it or not. Number 2, you shall not make or worship any graven images. Graven, sculpted, painted, carved, manufactured. A graven, an artistic form. Oh, you can have art. Art is wonderful. Art is pretty. Art will show you conceptualizations of all of the natural world and flights of fantasy, but you don't bow down and say, oh my God, my God, my God, my God, my God. Pardon me for picking on a certain culture, but the blue-skinned humanoid with the elephant head, and he's venerated as a deity. That's what we're talking about here. Right. That's an image. And this is a basic command, but the text goes on to become very specific in what these images might be. Remember I said humanoid form, elephant head? Okay. Quote, neither things on the earth, above the earth, or in the sea, nor creeping things that creep on the earth, unquote. Oh, this basically excludes the mammals, amphibians, reptiles, avian species, plant kingdom, all the aquatic life, and humans, as well as the whole of the planets, the sun, the moon, the galaxies, anything anyone might see on a starry night. Halley's Comet. There was a bunch. They thought it was their ride to I don't know where, and they all suicided when the comet took off in ellipsis. It can be supposed that in these things, the above argument of having been created and therefore less worthy of adoration than the Creator could be argued, and rightfully so. What if one merely wishes to worship an image of God himself according to what and who he says he is in the testaments, in the scriptures, or perhaps the enigmatic image of the Shroud of Turin? I mean, after all, science did its bit, and they say, this is a real deal. It may well not be a fabrication of somebody, some really genius painter. It has to do with how very little of the fabric actually holds the image. Kind of more like burned on than painted on. And they're still not exactly sure how that happened. Go to YouTube, Shroud of Turin. Lots of debate. Have at it. Do your own podcast. By the way, Spotify will allow you to do your own podcast directly with them, and you don't have to go to WordPress.com anymore. Isn't that a hoot? All righty. So, Shroud of Turin. Surely we're now focusing on an image of God himself. Aren't we? Are we? Maybe? We might be. But even that image on the shroud, if it's actually an after image of Jesus, and it's theorized that happened when he was resurrected, meaning that would have been his grave cloth. All right, supposing it is an image of Jesus. Well, isn't that nice? Now we know what the man looked like. Mr. Apple panned Dowdy himself. He didn't look like anything. Did the scriptures say he didn't look like much? Yeah, okay, fine. Surely we're focusing on an image of God. Or are we only focusing on one aspect of God in that shroud? Any image of God we might figure that we found, or we might create, or we might fabricate, is only ever going to represent but one aspect at any one time of God. Thus, it limits the picture of God. Neither does it create a desire or awareness of Him in His fullness. Therefore, we shortchange His glory in His very presence, and that is a slap in the face. I mean, if you wouldn't wish to be understood in that manner, what makes you think that God would either? How many things are in the news about libel and slander? So-and-so said and or wrote thus and such about me. Now I'm suing. Oh, I'm offended. Well, you're honing in on only one thing, one aspect. You're not talking about all the rest of me. We like to be known for who we are. We like to have relationships with others in friendship, in marriage. We like to get to know one another, all about one another. We're created in the image of God. We like to be known in our completeness, our fullness. Stands to reason He would too. Worshipping a graven or manufactured image only focuses on a single aspect. God is beyond the manufactured image, natural or otherwise, as far as human is beyond the single-celled amoeba. We cannot possibly manufacture a suitable iconography or representation of exactly who and what God is. We've never actually seen Him. We've only got the eyewitness testimony of Him as a man for a purpose. But God is not just a man. There's a whole lot more to Him. That's why we don't make the images, bow down, and worship them. You can make images all day long, but you don't call them God and worship them as God, especially since God sees everything you do. So anything you're doing is done in front of Him. Enough said. Commandment number 3. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Okay, guilty. Hands up. I quit. I'm guilty. I'm dead in the water. Boy, did I need a Savior. Thank God I've got one. All these first commandments have built on one another. If you haven't seen this by now, there you go. They build up on one another. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had a name by which He was known. This name is written in consonants only, and its pronunciation, its actual pronunciation, may well have been now lost to antiquity. In the modern day Hebrew, there is an approximation according to a text that has markings on it to help readers with pronunciation, called the Masoretic text. Yet the Masoretes themselves, for whom the text is named after, might very well have never actually heard what is known as the ineffable name of God. And that name may never actually have been spoken in their hearing. It's a name that is rumored in the Talmud, that in the uttering of it, it could produce nigh unto magical results. You called upon the name, and it was like a magic wand. Poof! There you go. The priesthood began to use the name in a manner that excluded the average man from ever hearing it. It's said that from high priest to next high priest, which is usually the son of the sitting high priest, that name was uttered and taught. And with it, the stricture to never utter it above a whisper. Did you hear that? Above a whisper. Well, everybody else is saying in the name, in the name, in the name, and then you're just whispering. You're whispering that unpronounceable, ineffable name. It's been intimated in the Talmud. That's sort of what they did. To cry unto the name, to lift up one's burden to the name, spoke of entrusting the trouble that one might encounter to one who is eminently able to handle any earthly difficulty that might arise among men. The name was to be used then for things appropriate to the one spoken of. The blood of sacrifice was to be offered up in his name because it had redemptive power. In that redemption was granted whatever sacrifice was accepted. Veneration, adoration, worship, extolment, glorification of the name were acceptable because in this one gave homage to the one so named. The giving of trust, when you cried out in the name and you lifted up your burdens to the name, speaking of entrusting the troubles, this giving of trust was in its own way a high note of worship. Anything less denigrated the one so named. After all, do we not like to have our names honored among men? Do we like it when our names are dragged through the mud? The name represents the person. The honor of the individual is often seen in their name. We go to court over somebody saying things about us or degrading our name. How much more the creator of the known and unknown universe? Need I say more? To take it in vain is to utter it void of power. Be careful when and how you utter the word God or Jesus or even Christ. It's so easy to break this commandment. Like I said, guilty is charged. Number 4, honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. This is one of the most hotly debated issues that has caused a splitting in the body of Christ. Paul the Apostle even makes mention of it in his teachings to the early church. Those who kept certain days were not to be criticized for doing so. They, in turn, were not to be judgmental to those who didn't. Jesus summed up the Sabbath issue thusly: the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, quote unquote. So then why all the hoopla? The understanding comes when we see why it was called for in the first place. In Genesis chapter 1, we see that after all was said and done, that God himself took a day of rest. He stopped for that one day, doing no more creative work. One has to realize that the heavens, the earth, everything on the earth, plant, animal, and human were already made. And that a day represented an evening and a morning. One day. And so for that one day, God was not, quote, fiddling in the garden, unquote, so to speak. There was no tweaks. Basically, he stopped, to admire his work. Oh, come on, he's God, for heaven's sake. If anybody wants to sit back and admire his work, it would be him. I mean, if you want to stroke an ego, stroke his. And if any being that was ever in existence was worthy and ought to have a big ego, someone who can create matter out of absolutely nothing just by wanting it to be so, and then speaking a command, and out of nothing, there it is. We call it the Big Bang. No, he deserves. He deserves. He can have an ego if he wants to. Yeah. So then, one wonders, however, did God take this one day off every week? Maybe not. Does it really matter? I know that Jesus had said, up until now my Father has been working, and so now I'm working. And Jesus had this annoying habit of healing people, especially on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man, and man was not made for the Sabbath. Does a parent model before us as children things that they believe are bad for us? That's actually a poor choice of words, daughter of Zion, because, yeah, there are a lot of people who are lousy parents, and they model the worst stuff, sticking a contraband drugs in their kitty Wonks' diapers. God pity the child when he pees on it and it breaks and it makes him go cuckoo because it gets in his bloodstream through his thin skin. So then, under normal circumstances, the rhetorical answer would be, of course not! We're all good parents, right? We model before our children the good things. So then there's a twofold principle here, especially in the light of Jesus' words about Sabbath being made for the man and not man for the Sabbath. First off, it's a day of rest. It's to break from job, and a time to relax, to slow down, to pause. Statistically, it's been proven that those who fail to take time to slow down are far more likely to die young or of cardiac arrest than those who do. It's a time to get away from the pressure cooker of daily living and recharge the batteries. It's a simple principle of 1 day of rest in 7, leaving the other 6 for work. This enforcement of rest was strictly held to the point that manna, something that God provided in the desert to feed the nation while they were in the desert for 40 years, wasn't provided for on that day. It would have to be gathered in 2 portions on the eve of Sabbath, and if it was gathered in multiple portions and stored up any other day, but on Sabbath Eve, where it had to last for 2 days, the next day you would find it spoiled. But on the eve of the Sabbath, or Shabbat, you used up the pre-Sabbath portion, prepped your Sabbath day portion, and set that aside to eat the next day. And guess what? It didn't spoil. Of course, if you went out looking for the manna, guess what? It wasn't there. If you wanted to gather sticks to make a fire, guess what? You could get killed for that. Somebody jerk you up by your collar, fling you down on the ground before the judges, and say he was gathering sticks on Sabbath, he was going to light a fire. Next thing you know, you're out in the backside of the wilderness, and you're being rocked to death with stones. All right, well, the premise here was not only that God didn't want anyone collecting the manna, but also that God wasn't going to be putting any out on Sabbath either. That answers the question of if he rested every Sabbath thereafter, doesn't it? Well, at least it does for that 40 years. We still have the my father's been working up until now, and so am I business that Jesus talked about. In fact, scriptures do indicate that the kindling of a fire for warmth and cooking was forbidden on Sabbath. So you either tended the one that was lit before the Sabbath, or you did without till the first day of the week. Of course, then Judaism got crafty, and they couldn't kindle it, but they could get a Gentile to come in and kindle it. Shabbos Gentile, y'all. That's where the idea comes from. Get around that commandment by making someone else break it. Another aspect of the Sabbath was holiness, the holiness observance of Sabbath. If the Sabbath was only a day to kick back and enjoy family and friends and do whatever one pleased, then we might argue weekend warriorship. Yet in the Old Testament, the way to God's heart was to not do those things which please oneself on Sabbath, but to turn the foot to going about doing what pleased God on Sabbath. You would be surprised how unrestful Sabbath can actually be. When you give your bread to someone else, when you are caring for someone else, when you are seeking his face in worship. So you're not just taking a nap for a day, are you? You see, God both wants that we should care for each other and seek to know him more when we take time off to relax. Therefore, this is a day to turn off from the week completely and to seek to serve and to know the one who gave us all we have. That was the point. Now, in modern day Christianity, the day has been much disputed between the two factions, Adventists and Sabbath keepers, and everyone else. They say Saturday, we say Sunday. The whole point has entirely been missed. Moreover, now with the modern day culture that has so infiltrated the personal lives of most believers, so as to water down their desire to know God entirely, it basically renders this command pointless. So we're killing ourselves, and we're dying a spiritual death. And those of us who are in Christ are living far below what we could have here on earth. I, the speaker, included. Commandment number 5. Honor your father and your mother, that it may go well with you in the land which I give you to possess. It looks like there's a promise with this one. So now we turn from the narrowing in of the upward attendance to the outward expanding of the outward attendance. The last 4 commandments had to do with how we treat God. The next 6 are going to deal with how we treat man. Interesting. In fact, the menorah has 1 upward post and 6 outward branches. There's a hot tip for you. So we start with the parental authority of the house in which we live that we consider safe. This, as Paul puts it, is the first commandment with a blessing tied to the observance of it. To possess the land was to have the right to live on the land that was formerly settled by another civilization. To conquer and otherwise annex that land meant that one had to follow the orders of the one in charge. Following the right chain of command kept one ever able to combat and win over the civilizations that were squatting on the land set aside for the chosen ones. This would be Book of Joshua, Books of Moses, and Canaan, or Canaan. It is to the leadership that God is supposed to talk to the most, and they are to lead the troops in the safe routes for battle. If they caused the death of these troops, they were held responsible. However, if the troops were not disposed to obey the leadership, then those troops were on their own, often with disastrous results. In the family, where behavior is learned, the leadership falls to the parents. And it is the parents that lead the children through the minefield of human growth and development. Failure to learn to honor and thus obey and respect parents leaves a person who is now more inclined to run alone and have no use or respect for any kind of authority or leadership. Such a one might run the risk of incalculable loss, even death. In the news, we had those who face off against the police and are shot down by the police. If you had just dropped the gun, put down the knife, stopped running, you might have lived. Maybe if you had learned to be a law-abiding citizen in the first place, you wouldn't have had to deal with the cops. You wouldn't have been run in by the police. Oh. Statistically, they say single parents, women usually, no father figures. And so the boys don't learn respect. Funny how the boys who learn to respect mama, really learn to respect mama, are still not in prison or in jail or in legal trouble. There might not be two people in the house that are parents. There might be only one. But that parent has been respected. That child has learned to respect authority. Oh, okay. Moreover, the parent begets and disciples the child and represents the Creator God in that the child is, quote, created in the womb of the mother, unquote. And both parents have contributed to that which is necessary to create another human being. Thus, in honoring the parents, one is honoring God as Creator and as authority. Now, the next 5, you'll see, stem out of this. If you can't do this, the honoring of the parent, you're going to have trouble doing all the rest. So, number 6, you shall not kill. The word for kill is not unintentional. It's intentional killing. And I don't mean in war either. I mean in peacetime, aka murder. It's better understood as premeditated murder. For in the Scriptures, a provision is made for what we might call manslaughter. God knows the difference between 2 men in the woods chopping down trees and the slipping of an axe from its handle on the backstroke, burying the blade into and killing the guy behind you who is also felling a tree, and turning around and burying your axe blade into his back purposefully. God knows the difference. Interestingly enough, the punisher was a family member of the deceased called the Avenger of Blood. In other words, a hit was always going to be put out on the murderer, whether it was intentional or unintentional. And a life would be taken for the life of the deceased. This is one sure way of closure. It has a downside, though. If the person committed manslaughter, to kill that person would be inappropriate. Therefore, cities of refuge that person could run to and live in for the rest of the life of the high priest in office, which could be a life sentence, by the way, for that individual, were set up in each territory. These cities were God's penal colonies. Yes, folks, there was a jail system in Judea and in Israel, in Canaan. They were called cities of refuge. Otherwise, if convicted of premeditated murder, the officials of the refuge city were obliged to turn that individual over to the quote-unquote avenger of blood for execution. Life is seen as precious in the eyes of God. The difference here lies in that there would be hatred in the heart towards the deceased on the part of the killer. To premeditate murder, there is motive. There's a desire to destroy that life and a plan as to how to destroy that life and hopefully get away with it. Whereas manslaughter is the unintended death, the accident, the incident, the best laid plans that go horribly wrong. But the killer had no hatred towards the deceased. That's the difference. You were drunk and lost control of your car and plowed through a bunch of Venezuelans sitting at a bus stop, or your brakes failed and you plowed through a bunch of Venezuelans sitting at a bus stop, but you had nothing on your mind against any of the Venezuelans sitting at a bus stop. And oh, by the way, as of the airing of this episode, that is actually in the news. That makes this person guilty of X amount of counts for each Venezuelan that died is a count of manslaughter. Now he's going to go away. His life is ruined. But he didn't do it premeditatively. Or did he? We haven't decided yet. The other thing could be he's not loving the fact that these people keep coming into the country and he wants to do something about it, and so he just aims his vehicle at a bunch of Venezuelans sitting at a bus stop and mows them down. As one man said in Spanish, that the Venezuelan victims were like bowling pins and the vehicle was like a bowling ball. Now, the only other loophole would be war. The soldier kills because he's ordered to engage the enemy. The conditioning of the soldier makes them hate their enemy. So to facilitate slaughter, usually we're going to be pushing back the enemy off of our territory, or we're annexing a place on behalf of someone else who can't defend their own borders. Right. Outside of war, however, a premeditated strike is called murder. Even in war, such activity is still murder. It's like the act of David the king on Uriah the Hittite, husband of the woman he got pregnant, wherein he tried to get the husband to come home on furlough to sleep with the woman in order to cover up the pregnancy. And when the man refused to, David had him put out on the skirmish front, at the front of the battle lines, and then stranded. So he would be behind enemy lines and die there. That was murder. What he did to get the man's wife pregnant was known as, adultery. Which leads us to commandment number 7. You shall not commit adultery. The marital relationship is the one relationship most closely identified in Scripture with the relationship of God to man in salvation. Therefore, anything concerning it must be tied into that divine relationship. If one did not worship any other god but God himself, or devote himself to any other image but the person of God, who is no image but is spirit, then why would one treat the object of their intimate affections any different? This brings out a point. The relationship of God and man in salvation is best seen in marriage. Marriage has in it one thing that sets it apart from all other relationships. In marriage, there is provided a means of gratification that will reproduce the species, i.e., sex. In our relationship to God, there is a means that provides gratification of the Spirit and reproduces itself in the life lived and the witness given for more souls into the kingdom, and that is worship. No, worship is not sex. Get that out of your head right now. In fact, I need to pause here. Another word for sex is intercourse. Another concept for intercourse is dialogue. Two persons are communicating verbally, non-verbally, in actions, but it's still a communication. Like a dance, it's a communication. One leads, the other follows. And when that communication backfires, somebody's toes get stepped on. Okay, so worship is also an intercourse of your spirit with God's spirit. God is worshipped, and you are blessed. There you go. So, in intercourse, both parties unite and receive a mutual benefit. But each party's benefit is arrived at differently. The act, however, is so designed that passionate attention to it will accommodate the desires of both parties. That's the sex. The same applies to worship, for in the act passionately attended to, both God and man derive a benefit spiritually. God is worshipped, and out of his enjoyment of having been worshipped, he grants blessing, and you receive the benefit of being blessed. Oh, okay. God receives the glory due him, and man receives the pleasure of God's presence and the joy of his pleasure in being given his due, the blessing. Furthermore, because of this intimacy, bonds of trust and ties of the soul and spirit are formed, and if either party forms the same relationship with another outside of this union, there comes a tearing apart of those bonds, which ruin the lives not only of the couple, but also of their offspring as well. Similarly, the bonds of trust and ties of the soul and spirit to God, if one strays from him, are subject to tearing, and the resulting hypocrisy can be seen and cause the downfall of those we have been an example to. When the pastor of the church got caught, ellipsis, what happened to his church? Marriage is about loyalty. Our quote-unquote love to God is about loyalty. To become intimate in intercourse with another outside of marriage, of the marriage union, is to break the loyalty you promised when you first took the token, aka the ring. The same goes with worshiping other idols or things before God, who sees and knows our daily activities in detail. You know, he saves us, and we're still going after other stuff instead of spending time with him. We call that spiritual adultery. Oh, okay. Commandment number 8. Commandment number 7 was, you shall not commit adultery. Commandment number 8, you shall not steal. Now we expand outward from the parental unit and the marital unit to the society as a whole. If you can't treat your parents with respect, and you can't treat your marriage with respect, what makes you think you're going to treat anybody else with respect? These last 3 commands will deal with one's neighbor, who could be righteous or sinful, a Christian or non-believer. To deprive a person of that which is their just due is just the same as removing from them by force that which is their lawful property. Often when we think of theft, we think of property or civil rights, but theft can be broadened to include such things as taking credit for the work of another, plagiarism, violation of copyright laws, fraud. Taking credit robs the individual of the satisfaction of hard work. This makes them less likely to try to put forth effort the next time they do something. They slack off, depriving their job of proper labor, thus depriving the company its due revenue for either the quantity or the quality of the work. Now you're robbing a corporation as well as an individual. Plagiarism removes the appropriate recognition for the work of the person from them. If you're going to copy the text, in the parentheses, tell everybody where you got the text from. Give credit to the individual. Don't plagiarize. It's the theft of one's honor by robbing credit for work done when we speak of violating copyright law. That's the same as plagiarism. It's just that somebody went to the expense of paying for the Library of Congress to record their work, to copyright the work. So you've stolen them that money for that work and their credit for what they did. Fraud, however, is just like robbery or simple theft. It removes trust between people and can also deprive another of their income reserves or their nest egg. Fraud is perhaps the worst kind of stealing because it ruins a person's whole life. There's only one worse type of stealing, and that would be rape, the theft of the honor of a woman. And I will cover that after I'm done with these commandments. Breaking an entry, or assault and theft, are the most common understandings of this commandment. But Jesus raises the bar. For to consider another with envy in the heart is also considered by God to be stealing. If you can want to do it, eventually you're going to give in to your desire to do it. And someone is going to have goods missing, some one way or another. Which leads us to number 9. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor, otherwise known as perjury. Tattletaling is the first manner in which we bear false witness. Usually kids tattle to get the other kid in trouble, so the tattle is usually skewed or an outright lie. Yet to bear witness is to testify to what a neighbor has done in a court of law, isn't it? A false witness will ruin the reputation and honor of a man, ruining himself, his self-esteem for life. The removal of a man's honor is a form of theft, fraud. But it's not an actual defrauding or direct action. It's rather the deception that changes the opinion of others towards that one individual. In some cases, false witness can be tantamount to murder. Why? Ever hear the death penalty? And so died for a crime they actually didn't commit? And then up years later, DNA, and we find out who actually did commit the crime. Oh, and then when that gets out, the state is impugned. Oh, look, you're so stupid you can't even get the case right. You can't even judge correctly. Well, somebody lied. Okay. A false witness is character assassination and character rape. That today we assign a legal value to character assassination called libel or slander speaks to the need for the honor of one's reputation and their name. What was that commandment about? Don't take the name of the Lord in vain. This is taking the name of someone else and ruining it or making it useless. Legally, the false witness can also help the criminal go free by convicting the innocent in the place of the guilty. False witness tantamount to murder? Tantamount to murder? Capital punishment? Right. The death penalty? This then leaves the judicial system accountable for innocent blood. God is not pleased to have to bring judgment against the judiciary for someone's perjury. The perjurer was always put to death, which leads us to why someone would bear false witness in the first place. What is the thing that causes us to rape, steal, kill, defraud, bear false witness? Because you're either perjuring to protect someone or to get even with someone. If you're perjuring to protect someone, you're probably perjuring to protect your spouse. Oh, we'll see, a married spouse cannot testify in a court of law because it's assumed they will perjure themselves. But a mother might want to perjure to protect her child. That's still perjury. However, there is another reason why someone might perjure, definitely why they might kill or steal, and that is coveting. Commandment number 10, you shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. Here is the root of the other three laws. Covetousness. It springs from a desire that will not be satiated. It's a demanding drive of want for what belongs to someone else because it belongs to them and not you. James speaks of wanting what is someone else's and not being able to get it. So then one bites and devours and murders. To want the same car that your neighbor has and then plan to go and buy one from a dealership is not coveting. To scheme as to how to get it from your neighbor is. It's also known as theft or carjacking. To like the type of service your neighbor has in their house staff or lawn service or some sort of maintenance, and to inquire where they got their temp help from and apply for temps from the same company is not coveting. But to Shanghai your neighbor's servants into your home is. This is the thing that leads to false witness and theft and adultery and murder, all for the sake of a trinket, a toy, a tool, a momentary pleasure. What we own, we have because it helps us maintain our property and belongings, or it makes us look good, or it makes us feel good. To seek ways to remove from us these things is to rob us of the ability to keep order and discipline and maintenance of our property and our lives and the pursuit of happiness. If we can't maintain that which is our personal property, then we begin to see a decay in the order of society as a whole, which does not make for safe future to any generation. And if we deprive each other of the happiness, will we just get more bloodshed? That in turn can end humanity as we know it. Covetousness, then, might be seen in the business that grabs companies and tears them apart for profit. It's most often the reason for assault and battery. It's the greatest driver of criminal activity. It's the true definition of jealousy that is not zeal for the good, but unreasonable desire for what is not one's own. You hear children, there's one toy. The room is littered with all sorts of things that those children can do, but there's going to be the one that someone else has, and that one kid will invariably go up to the other and grab the thing they have, rip it away from them, and say, "Mine! Gimme! Want it!" Knock the other kid down to the ground, traipse off with their trophy. Meanwhile, the other kid is laying on the ground, could be injured, probably not. Kids are very resilient. But he's going to howl because the thing he was just simply innocently enjoying himself with was stolen from him. And it didn't help to be bullied in the process. You do realize the child that took the toy could be held accountable for assault and battery and theft because, "Gimme! Mine! Want it!" That's covetousness. So, I wish to close this with a word on rape. Rape is a crime of coveting. One covets the power over another, usually a woman, or one covets the pleasure of intercourse. But instead of giving for mutual pleasure, the self-seeking rapist only takes that which he thinks is rightfully his and then leaves the ruined husk behind. Rape murders the soul's integrity, strips the covering of honor and self-respect, and bears a false witness to the impurity of a woman. Rape also defiles the purity of the essence of the soul of the woman afflicted, which will in turn forever impair the union between her and anyone or anything else, quite possibly including God. So deep is the violation that unless a supernatural intervention is immediately made, such a woman, quite possibly, will ever have a scar where an opening of the heart in trust and innocence should be. People who have been raped have had a defilement deeper than any human intervention can penetrate, and they should be dealt with in the greatest of compassion and understanding. The deepest cut of rape is this, that the afflicted will never again trust themselves, let alone anyone else. It is easy to see the problem that can arise in a relationship with God, let alone a spouse. In some cases, it is so profound because it has been so cyclically repeated in the life in covert or overt ways that the whole of the person closes off to any and every other person, even God. He can heal such profound wounds, but the process will only be done with great difficulty, not on God's part, but because God is a gentleman. He's not going to force himself like the rapist did. And the victim isn't really going to be willing to open up to God. Such an individual becomes mentally unbalanced and spiritually defiled to the point of madness, believing themselves to derive pleasure from the act of degraded intercourse and even seeking remuneration for such. They call those ladies of the night, or whores, or believing themselves to be worthless and thus becoming the doormat of all society. We see these the most on the streets, unkempt, untouchable, viciously hitting and spitting like a cornered animal, lost in their own little universe, hearing the voice of the enemy driving them to perversion themselves or to do anything to dull the pain and silence the voice of scorn. These fill up our psychiatric institutions and our morgues. Physical rape is bad enough, but far worse is the verbal and nonverbal rape perpetrated on our young by uncaring, unloving individuals who never wanted the responsibility for the children in the first place, being similarly treated themselves. God will hold accountable every soul responsible for the loss of those innocents defiled in this manner, and the penalty will be pitiless. Thus, this action can be seen to be equal in many ways to false witness, coveting, theft, and murder. Today, we're seen to be free from the Torah law, but are we really? Even Jesus touched on the law by boiling it down to these two statements, found in Mark 12:29 through 31, and Matthew 23:37 through 40. Mark 12:29 through 31, quote, Jesus answered him, the first of all the commandments is this, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. This is the first commandment, and the second like it is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these, unquote. Matthew 22:37 through 40, quote, Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets, unquote. When he talks about the law and the prophets, he talks about the whole of the Old Testament. For one can basically boil it down to the Decalogue, and out of that comes all the statutes for the temple and the ecclesiastical rules which were expressed in Leviticus, and the general laws of government and case law included in the judgments that were made in the time of Moses for when various issues arose in Deuteronomy. All these tie back to the Decalogue or Ten Commandments. They either deal with the first or second set of 5 which deal with the interaction with God and with one's fellow Jew. The statement has also been made that there was to be one law for the native-born Israelite within his or her tribe, and for sojourners who might settle amongst the Israelites, as well as those who would become their forced labor. The only difference is that for the Israelite, they are in covenant and they are circumcised, whereas the sojourner might not be. Thus, sacerdotally and religiously, there was inclusion for the Israelite, but not for the stranger of the land who was sojourning. But these have to do with partaking of certain activities like feast days. The whole rest of the law that dealt with everything from inheritance to marriage, dietary, disease like leprosy, criminal activity, dealing with the 5 commandments regarding dealing with one another applied across the board. In Christendom, we tend to adhere to the quote-unquote new commandment to, quote, love one another, unquote. But this is an extension of the Decalogue. The point is that now Christ, having kept the whole law on our behalf, paying the penalty on our behalf, grants us the grace of having kept the law through himself, and by his Holy Spirit empowers us to continue to keep it, not in slavish observance, but in heartfelt attitude and expression of holiness, which causes us to not want to do that which the law itself prohibits. I will make mention that Gentiles were released from the observance of Torah law, for the most part. However, Jesus' expression of the whole law as seen in Mark and Matthew is still valid for every one of us Gentiles today. It's known as the Golden Rule. Treat others as you would have them treat you. That includes God and man. For if we would be loyal, loyalty might be seen as God's love language to God, and treating everyone as we wanted to be treated, and giving special caring for those who are fellow believers, then we're doing the whole of the law. This is sort of what James was talking about in James 1:21 through 22, being a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Doing the word is doing what he who is the word has told us to do. Believe it or not, in the New Testament, there are like 40 some odd new additions to the 10 in the Old Testament. In our next episode, we'll look into these and what they might be. Until then,